So welcome to everyone if it's your first History at Home with the Montclair History Center. And tonight we're welcoming the Friends of the Howe House, which we're thrilled to have. I'm Angelica Diggs, so I'm the director of the Montclair History Center. And tonight we're going to be embarking on some of the history and mysteries the Friends of the Howe House historians have uncovered in their research, and they're going to share that knowledge with us to date, and hopefully answer some of the questions you might have and learn more about their organization. So just to introduce our historians tonight, which you also see up on the screen, we're welcoming Betty Holloway, who is a Friends of the Howe House board member, chair of the Montclair African American Heritage Association, and also is a former adjunct professor at Passaic County College. We also welcome Janice Gilliard, who is the past president of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society and board member for the National Genealogical Society and the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. You almost got me tongue-tied there. And also welcome to Mike Farrelly, trustee of the Montclair History Center, and the official Montclair Township historian since 2004. And we also welcome Zeph Zylstra, a history professor at New York City College of Technology at the City University of New York. For those of you who heard me say this quite a few times, if you are more than one person or more than 20 miles away, please just put that in the chat for us tonight. Our grant funders love to know that information that we report on. So this program was made possible by a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, which is a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we do thank them for their support tonight and making tonight's program free and accessible. Please use the chat throughout tonight. We are going to ask we hold any live Q&A until the end of the presentation, because it's possible some questions will get answered as we go through. I will keep an eye on the chat. If there's something I can answer, or I'll make sure I flag it and make sure I ask that on your behalf later at the end of the program, I'm happy to do that as well. So at this point, I'm going to hand it right off to the historians to kick us off for Friends of the Howe House. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Angelica, I want to thank you for that introduction. And the history team at the Friends of the Howe House has been doing a lot of work in the last year, a lot of new discoveries, and we're really excited to share them with the Montclair community and clearly many people sort of beyond Montclair. So with that, and I'm having a little bit of trouble sharing here in terms of the slides. There we go. Okay, so we are looking at the Howe House right here. This is a house that, probably many of you have driven past. I'd driven past it, probably hundreds of times before I knew who James Howe was, and that it is probably a portion of it is probably the oldest standing structure in Montclair. So we're still sussing those details out, but we don't know of a standing structure in Montclair that goes back beyond, before the Howe House. And what we're looking at in the image on the right here is some social activism there. The Friends of the Howe House about a year ago took possession of this house, and we are turning that into a research center, an educational center, and we're going to sort of use that to enrich the citizens of Montclair and beyond. So, the nonprofit organization has been formed recently, and it really is a diverse collection of local community members. A variety of different groups have sort of contributed, including the Montclair History Center, into sort of putting the Friends of the House together. And the idea is that we're going to sort of empower New Jerseyans with knowledge about sort of our shared legacy, of a state that held enslaved people, where slavery was sort of an important part of the development of New Jersey, and we're going to sort of explore some of that, in terms of the history of this house. It's going to be a touch point for many different sort of topics related to Black history, and slavery is going to be a big part of that. So today we have a sort of a wide-ranging presentation for you that's going to touch on a variety of topics. We're going to be looking at sort of the house and the land, and developments that occurred on the land. We're going to be looking about, we're going to be looking at the Howe family and the other people that were important to the Howe, to their story, to the Howe family story. We're going to be examining the relevance of genealogy, particularly to Black families, looking at the material culture that's important in Black history, and we're going to do a brief history of slavery in New Jersey. And to sort of kick us off here, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Mike Farrelly, and he's going to be introducing us to some of the developments related to sort of land and the use of the land that occurred in the 1800s. So, Mike, I'm going to let you take it away.
Terrific. You see here, well, I don't know, are we going to get much into the genealogy of the Crane family?
I think I mean, you can start that, but I think Betty might talk about that a little bit.
Okay. I'm just going to make it real simple. The Nathaniel Crane, who is the subject of our studies, was the grandson of the original Nathaniel Crane. The original Cranes who settled in Montclair were Nathaniel and Azariah Jr. Uh, there were, I've said this a few times, it gets very confusing because in English convention at the time, you named your first son after your father, and you named your second son after your grandfather, after the son's grandfather. Well, in a few generations, everybody's got the same name. So there were about 15 Nathaniels running around. This Nathaniel was not the Nathaniel of the Nat Crane House of the History Center. You know, he was just one of the many Nathaniels who lived in Montclair at the time. The Crane family had slaves. And in 1817, this Nathaniel he manumitted, he freed a slave by the name of James Howe. In 1831, he wrote a will and gave the house that James lived in, plus 6 acres of property, $400, and an unspecified amount of land in a place called the Salt Meadow. And we don't exactly know where it is. I have a few guesses, but we don't exactly know where that is. And then it was hinged on Nathaniel's wife, Hannah. Everything would pass to James Howe and to the other people mentioned in the will after Hannah died. So in 1836, Hannah passed away, and the land officially went to James Howe, the 6 acres. And when I first came along here, I kind of tried to figure out what the 6 acres looks like now. I've done a bunch of research and I'm not totally positive, but I believe that the outline of this map here is the 1857 map. If you went to look at it today, I believe that the rough borders of the territory are Claremont Avenue, Upper Mountain Avenue, and especially where the MKA sports field is. In fact, the MKA sports field makes up most of the original 6 acres. Not quite all of it, but most of it. And if you go down Upper Mountain Avenue, the boundary that begins 64 Upper Mountain Avenue was the northernmost border of the 6 acres. That is what I believe. What we have here are 3 slides. One is what the property looked like in 1837, what the property looked like in 1844, and then what the property looked like in 1869 from left to right. In 1837, there was only one house on the 6 acres. This slide here was done before we had our current information, so it shows 2 houses, those little black dots, but there was one house, the James Howe house. We believe that James passed away in 1861, and I believe we're not sure when Susan passed away, but it was sometime around 1862. At that point, the 6 acres reverted to the Howe children. That was James Henry Howe, known as Henry, and Delilah. And she married a guy by the name of James Jackson. So it was her name would have been Delilah Jackson. Before that, if we go to the middle slide, just before he passed, well, a little before he passed away, 1844, James Howe sold a quarter of an acre to somebody named Francis Oliver. And Francis Oliver built a house. So if you look at that striped section, there are two houses. There is the original James Howe house and a new house built by Francis Oliver and his family. The new house is gone. It has been torn down. It no longer exists. As I said, the property, the 6 acres, was divided up between Henry Howe and Delilah Jackson, pretty much down the middle. Henry moved away. He was in the house in the 1840s. We know that. He lived, when he was growing up, he lived in the Howe house. He moved away and we're not sure where, but he continued to own half of the original 6 acres. He sold part of that property to a guy by the name of Thompson, Reverend Charles H. Thompson, who was a minister, Presbyterian minister, and was the pastor of the Plain Street Presbyterian Church in Newark. Now, Charles and his wife Elizabeth never built on the property either. They continued to own it for a while. And then some of the property eventually became part of belonged to the Fitzsimmons family. And Delilah Howe Jackson and James Jackson built a house for themselves. So in 1869, there were 3 houses on the original 6 acres. Now the house that Delilah and James built is gone too. There is a house on the spot, on the site now, but the house that is there now, just to the west of the Howe house, the house that is there now was built in the 1920s. It is not Delilah and James' house. Yeah, so that's pretty much what happened, except that because there's more stuff that happened, sure. For one thing, the Greenwood Lake and New York Railroad wanted to build a tunnel through the top of the mountain, starting about where the Annan Flag Company used to be, coming through the mountain, and then emerging somewhere just behind the Howe house. They wanted to build a tunnel, and they wanted to continue to build the railroad and connect to their main line, which was down pretty much where the Bay Street train station is now. So the 6 acres got divided up. The Jacksons, Delilah and James, and the Olivers and the Howes gave a right of way to the railroad. And that right of way is pretty much the gorge that is right behind the Howe house now. If you walk out to the Howe house and you go to the back of their property, there's a real sudden drop. And that is where the railroad was supposed to go through. Now the railroad was never built. The railroad what's that?
Approximately what year was that arrangement with the
That
railroad?
would have been would have been 1868, 1869, when the railroad bought the right of way. They never built it. It's it's interesting. There are little bits of evidence all throughout Montclair where the railroad was supposed to go. For instance, the back of Tierney's bar, the rear door is on a slanted angle. And people question that. Why isn't it square like with the rest of the building? Well, the reason why is because that property was cut off by the railroad right of way. So little pieces of evidence throughout all of Montclair.
Thanks, Mike. That's great.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think the other thing I want to say is that they were not, because they were not wealthy people, they were, don't want to say they were poor, but they certainly weren't wealthy. Over time, the Howes and the Olivers were forced to sell off pieces of those 6 acres. And probably by 1878, all that was left was just that little square that you see on the map on the far right. It says Oliver. I forgot to mention that at some point, after James Howe died, Francis Oliver moved into the Howe house. That little square there both houses belonged to the Olivers for a short while. Francis Oliver sold off his house, his original house, to a lady by the name of Mary Doyle. And the house that Delilah and James built, well, that property, the whole property, they had originally, Delilah was given half of the property, half of the 6 acres. Originally, what happened is they got a mortgage to build and maintain the property. They defaulted on the mortgage. It was tough financial times, and they were not wealthy. And Delilah's portion of the 6 acres became the property of a guy by the name of Amzi Ziegler. Now, turnabout, if karma is a strange thing, Amzi Ziegler got a mortgage on the property, and he lost this property later on, about 1888. He lost the property to the Chapin family. So anyway, the main point that I want to make is that 6 acres, they had to sell it off to survive. And eventually the property just passed out of the Howe family hands and the Oliver family's hands. And I think we should talk a little bit about the Howe family tree, and I think that's yours, Betty. You're muted, Betty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. To continue the story about the Howe family, we have discovered some details about James and Susan Howe and his family, but we have only scratched the surface as we continue to research and uncover more information because of the importance it has to Montclair history. Based on documents, census data, and descriptions in Philip Doremus's book, Reminiscences of Montclair, published in 1908, I have attempted to create a brief profile of his family and their neighbor, as Mike just described them, the Olivers. Philip Doremus was a grocery store owner on Bloomfield Avenue and a relative of the Crane family. He described James Howe as Uncle Jim. He further mentions that he was Major Nathaniel Crane's old colored servant and a survivor of the former slaves of the family. I use the title Major Nathaniel Crane when I talk about the Nathaniel, as Mike described how difficult it is to separate all of the Nathaniels in this family. So he was, throughout Philip Doremus's book, he referred to him as Major Nathaniel Crane. So I follow suit with his description. So Mike mentioned earlier that Major Nathaniel Crane had made provisions for James Howe in his will. Doremus described Howe as someone who used to tell stories that he loved to hear about their ancestry. He mentioned Mr. Howe was blind, and we found this to be true in the 1850 census. Doremus gave a more detailed account of Mr. Howe's storytelling when he shared a tale about the development of industries in Montclair. It was the story about the sawmill and cider mill located on Tony's Brook at Bay Street. Mr. Howe said he used to go with Deacon Joseph Crane to the mill to assist him in sawing logs into boards. It was first necessary to cut the logs into the proper length for the boards, this being done with a handle or cross-cut saw. The old gentleman took the handle of one end of the saw and young colored Jim the other. With a twinkle about his face, Jim said, back and forth the old man kept the saw and me going without a stop till the cut was finished. Doremus ended the quote with Jim saying he was glad when the work was done. The importance of a quote like this is that we get the actual words coming from Mr. Howe living on that property, interacting with the Crane family. Beth Shepard, a history team member, found Howe's manumission paper, which was dated April 14th, 1817. There were 6 signatures to manumit Mr. Howe. 2 signatures from the overseers of the poor, 2 justices of the peace, and 2 witnesses were needed in addition to Nathaniel Crane's signature. In Ed Goodell's book, Montclair, The Evolution of a Suburban Town, published in 1934, he shared a similar story about Major Nathaniel Crane's will of the property to Mr. Howe. However, there was a remarkable distinction. He lamented, the little settlement is destined to remain in possession of James Howe, his heirs and assigns, much longer than some of the white people about to come to this hillside. In 1934, all 6 acres had been sold at least 30 years prior. I wondered why Ed Goodell had not updated the story or simply left it out of his book. What was his point? Upon Mr. Howe's death in 1862, his children were given the 6 acres. And as Mike mentioned earlier, the property was sold parcel by parcel until 1904, when the last part was sold. His daughter Delilah married a James Howe at the Plain Street Colored, as was mentioned earlier, in 1867. Delilah died of dropsy in 1883 and is buried in the Jackson family plot at the old cemetery at Rosedale. In 1883, his son James Henry Howe served 1 year in the Civil War with the U.S. colored troops in a cavalry unit. We don't know the exact number or the designation of the troop that he was with. Not yet. We're still searching for that information. We have more questions about the family that we would like to answer. So far, we only know where Delilah is buried. James, Susan, and Henry, the son, are cold cases in our research to date. We have some of the same questions about the Francis and Mary Oliver family. However, we know that James and Susan Howe sold a quarter, again, as Mike mentioned earlier, sold Frances a quarter of an acre in 1844 for $50. They were neighbors until the end, at least for James, Susan, and Frances. Mary, Frances's wife, lived with her youngest son, Theorem, until she was 99 years old. To date, we know that Theorem was well known and active in the township. In 1880, he was secretary of a group of Black Republican supporters for the Garfield and Arthur campaign for president. In 1895, he was a signatory on documents to the state of New Jersey to officially establish the first African-American church in Montclair, St. Mark's Episcopal Methodist Church, which had been worshiping in town since 1880. This is just a capsule of foundation about the Howe and Oliver family. Their history on this land seems to be inextricably tied. As we search to understand this relationship better, we're focused on the fact that they, the landowners, held on to the property for nearly 70 years. For nearly 250 years, the house at 369 Claremont Avenue continues to bear witness to a legacy that James and Susan Howe lived as the first African-American homeowners in the township. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. You know, Betty and I and some of the other history team members have talked quite a bit about, you know, was the parcel of land there a community? Was it a neighborhood? And, you know, we're not prepared to decide any of that yet. We don't have enough information about what other parts of a community were present or weren't present there. But Betty used a word a few months ago. She called it a seed. And I liked that. You know, she said, it probably wasn't a community, but what happened there was a seed perhaps for the growth of an African-American community in Montclair that might have developed in other places. So what we're seeing, you know, what Mike, talked about with the parcel of land there and what Betty has shown with these different families is that we're seeing growth, right? And we're seeing a transition from slavery to freedom and an experience of freedom there on that property, even if, as Mike was showing, that it was difficult. And all that sort of gives birth to the development of Black Montclair, perhaps in other places. And that's part of what our history team is going to be exploring. You know, to what degree and in what ways did this piece of land there connect to the development of sort of other Black families in Montclair and other places. So this is a brief here, sort of family tree of Nathaniel Crane. You know, Mike kind of went over this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But you saw from that early image of the map too that sort of the Howe piece of land there is surrounded by cranes early on, and there just was so much influence from the Crane family in this part of New Jersey. So we're going to next talk a little bit about genealogy, and we are really fortunate in the history team for the Friends of the Howe House to have some really excellent genealogists. And I'm going to turn this next part over to Janice Gilliard, who's going to talk a little bit about genealogy and African-American history and the importance of it.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to my counterparts who have already shared. Mike and I had a conversation earlier today about this entire project that, you know, there's so many different pieces and it's like a puzzle coming together. I am a family historian, genealogist, and do a lot of presentations, and I absolutely love history and genealogy, and both of them go together. I know that there are a number of arguments that are, you know, a lot of people are like history is history and no, well, what makes history? People. So they do go together and it's important. So importance of genealogy in the African-American history. What has happened with African-American genealogy in the past 20 years? And so for me personally, I've been doing my family research since for approximately, actually longer than 20 years, for about 25 years. And I can tell you that when I started, if you ever use Ancestry.com, back in the day, it is nothing like it is now. When I started, you were sitting there waiting for them to load census records for the states for each state and waiting for your state to come up. So we've come a long way. Ancestry.com, many people use that in family search. So records, availability of records. Ancestry, Family Search, and a lot of other sites have some really, really good information. I've seen that information grow. A lot of them acquire different, a variety of historical record sets that you can use. And if you're researching, I always encourage people to go back and check because they do it on a regular basis, both companies. They're not the only companies. So I shared a little bit about my story. And sometimes when we mention history and African Americans, I constantly hear that it's difficult. It's not difficult. It's challenging and it takes a lot of dedication. I've been able to trace my family back to 1720. I kind of fell into this project and fell in love with the story and the mystery and the intrigue of it. I am amazed at what this entire team has been able to do in a year's time. It's phenomenal. I've actually been on the property and it's very moving. And so here we go now. It's just what I said earlier. You've got a historic home, and then you have historians and genealogists and people who love genealogy going back in time and bringing that family history forward. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got involved. I did a presentation at the Presbyterian Church in Montclair, and again, was intrigued with the story. But one of the crazy things, because I want to highlight how, when you say what has happened with African American genealogy in the past 20 years, our stories, no matter who we are, they're intertwined. So here it is. I'm, working on this history project, looking at the genealogy, trying to bring James Howe forward, which we've done a great job with doing as far as we can. And then something says, that little nudging, if any of you have been looking for something, try to find it. Why don't you put the Crane name in? And this is going to tie into my, the second question here. Put the Crane name in your DNA matches. And so guess whose descendants are matching my DNA? The descendants of Major Nathaniel Crane. There are about 5 or 6 of them matching me. 4 of them are white and the other 2 are African American. My family is from South Carolina. So I live in Summit, New Jersey, fall into this project, and then find out that there is a slight connection. And so part of me wants to believe that connection, that somehow, and sometimes people aren't happy to hear this, but I do believe that in some way, James Howe and Major Nathaniel Crane were connected. And we've had this discussion, we spoke at Montclair Public Library, and my position is that for that time period, talking about history, right, genealogy, how many stories do you hear where somebody's giving somebody that much land, money, and a house? Okay, so
what would we do to sort of verify some of that information, Janice? So we've got, again, we were talking before this presentation began, a few of us, about how, scientists have hypotheses, and
right.
historians don't really have something like a hypothesis. We really have a similar process where we begin with research. We uncover a small amount of information, we take some educated guesses, and then we continue our research. And, so some of these, we really have many hypotheses about the house and the family. And in order, in terms of genealogy, to kind of make good on that hypothesis, what sort of research would we need, Janice?
Actually, I think that we're like in the thick of it now. And that is, what is your paper trail? And in history and genealogy, you're always told, follow the money. We've got a piece of that there as well. And then if you can factor in DNA, factor in DNA. And as I mentioned, I'm not the only person. And so back to the genealogy piece, you know what, we are going to, Mike and I had a discussion about, we have all of these pieces, we're going to keep doing the work and the story, just like as much progress as we have made within a year, I believe that we're going to continue to make progress. And so African-American genealogy over the past 20 years has evolved significantly. More online resources are available, books that focus on African-American genealogy, and we have a number of genealogy societies, both Black and white, or just national organizations, and a variety of workshops on how to do the research effectively. So from my own personal experience, and I'm sure many of you, I've seen a change in the information that's available, the books that are available. The Schomburg is part of the New York Library system, and I've been able to go and get books on several ancestors that I didn't even know existed, and I found that through WorldCat. One book was out of print. So I think that the internet has helped us quite a bit. I think that we still have to do some of the traditional methods of traveling, traveling or going to a library, looking in the archives. We don't throw that away, but I think that it's improved over the past 20 years. How has genealogy changed the ways we think about African Americans in U.S. history? So when I learned about James Howe, when I learned about Major Nathaniel Crane, and then some of the connections that we're all making, I believe that once we discover something, a major part of history, it's a shared history. Look at how we're all embracing this story. Look at how much interest is involved in this story. So I think that it has changed the way we think about African Americans in US history. We all have a story to tell. And I also believe that we're part of the history, but we're more connected than we think. Elizabeth and I were talking, and I think Elizabeth is connected to the Crane family as well. So what do? You keep, Jeff, you asked the question, well, what do you do? I think we keep working, we keep talking. When we find a connection, okay, well, let's see what we can figure out. I found out that there's a Crane family coming out of Connecticut. There was a Crane family there, and some of them came to New Jersey. Well, in me talking about my own personal family history, I thought we were only in South Carolina. We were not. We were out of Rhode Island and worked our way down. And so when I saw Connecticut, I've got family history in Connecticut. The Cranes were in Connecticut. So could that be it? So I think that we have to continue to be open-minded in our research. When we make connections, whether it's where a location or a family connection, that we don't operate in fear and say, well, I can't look at, I hope that Liz wouldn't look at me as, well, she's Black. I don't want to talk about that. You cannot fix anything unless you face it. We can't change history. We can change history if we're honest and we take the facts that we find and work together. We can make a difference. Look at what we've done already in a short amount of time, working together.
Thanks, Janice. It's interesting as a historian to and I've been studying history for a few decades now, to see things like the Roots Project at Harvard that's run by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and how he's taken genealogy, and Janice is right, a lot of historians look down on genealogy, but he's taken genealogy and he's used that to really engage both African Americans in the study of history, but then to change social history and to really sort of highlight ways that African Americans sort of have been involved in U.S. history. So genealogy, despite some historians sort of looking down on it, has really in the last 20 years brought more African Americans into mainstream historical studies. And I think that's—
Now, before you move on, I just want to say this. You said, how has it changed the way we think? I know for me, one of the things as far as history, and I'll make this quick, is that I found out that one of my ancestors ran the political campaign for a presidential campaign for Horace Greeley. It's not like, oh, let's incorporate, Black people into history. We've always been there. So the responsibility is on all of us to have the conversation, do your family history. Everybody has a story to tell. Do the family history, and you will be amazed at what you find. And I'll stop there with that one.
So as I was saying before, we have these hypotheses, for lack of a better word, that we're exploring in the history group as part of the Friends of the Howe House. And one of the things that we're examining is the relationship or the extent to which the Howes were connected to African Americans in Newark. And we have sort of a few pieces of information here, and Mike and Betty have both talked about the Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church, and a lot of work has been done on this in the last few years. They've gotten some big grants in Newark, and this is a site on the Underground Railroad, so there's been some work there. But I think this Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church was really an important Black community establishment, not just in Newark, but it seems to sort of be, bigger than Newark. And we know that, for example, Delilah Howe and James Jackson were married there. And that sort of raises larger questions about other connections between the Howe family and the Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church. Was there? And that's something that we're exploring right now. Reverend Charles H. Thompson, he was sort of the minister there for about a decade, and he was one of the property owners of the sort of original Howe 6-acre parcel. So that's sort of another Newark and Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church connection with the 6 acres. Betty has discovered that there was a carpenter that was contracted to do work on the property, whose name was Cato Thompson. And that appears to be a relative, possibly, we're exploring this. It's possible that Cato was a relative of Charles H. Thompson. So we're exploring whether that is also then another Newark connection. And the way history operates, and when we're doing research, is so we have these pieces of evidence here, right? So we've got 3-4 things, and that causes us to question, and again, so that the heading here: to what extent were the Howes connected to African Americans in Newark? And this is something that we're exploring. So the history team is going to continue to accumulate evidence, and maybe that that's a null hypothesis, right? Maybe we find out that there was 3 or 4 connections, and that's the extent of it. But what we want to do is sort of look at areas like this and try to see if we can expand them, and then draw larger historical conclusions about sort of urban-rural dynamics with African Americans or Black people, specifically with Newark. So that's the sort of thing. And I want to show a few images here. This is the Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church in Newark. And there was 3 different versions of this. I'm not sure which, I don't know the date of this image, but they had 3 different sites. And this is one of those. And I want to go back to the image on the left there is Charles Thompson. And this was published slightly a few years after he passed away. But was the owner of the crosshatched parcel of land there. So again, what is the relationship between the Reverend of the Plain Street Colored Presbyterian Church and the Howes, and that warrants sort of more exploration.
Jeff, real quick, with the gentleman Cato Thompson, if you could flip back a little bit, I think it's
Sure.
just 2 slides back. I did find several newspaper articles that talked about how wealthy he was.
Yes.
Yeah.
He
So
was described as one of the wealthiest Black residents of Newark. So and I think he probably began as a carpenter, but I think he was then a contractor. So probably if he was hired by the Howes, I doubt it was him swinging the hammer. He was the owner of a company then that was sending carpenters to the House. But again,
Okay.
Well, towards the end of his career, he was buying a lot of property and renting it out. That's what made him a rich man.
Right.
Yeah.
this
And
is all
for the
that
church,
we need
for the
to
Plain Street Colored Church, I'm sorry, I don't want to forget to highlight this for everyone. The land that it was on is a part of the National Park. It's designated by the National Park Service as a historic site. And also it's a part of, and I have to check to see what the status is, but the New Jersey Black Heritage Trail as well.
We should also mention that the Plain Street Presbyterian Church is no longer in existence.
Right.
The,
The
s-
land.
the site is, the church is gone.
And so what we're one of the things we want to show through our research here, and one of the themes that you're seeing, is that we're just beginning, but this is exciting, and we've done a lot, but it's slow going also. In my own personal research, I mean, that's not related to the Howe House. I would say that when I'm researching Black people compared to white people, it takes twice as long to do the work because the archives haven't collected the material, or they've not preserved it well, or it's not been organized well. It's difficult social history research when we're investigating families like the Howes. And I was hoping that some of the other members would be able to kind of comment on some of these complications. So what are some of the difficulties of doing research when we're examining the lives of African Americans?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Again, I go back to what I said earlier. It's a little difficult, it's a little challenging, but it's not impossible. I can't wait to get back to the Schomburg because they have more resources than most people realize when it comes to African Americans, our history, and throughout the country. So I plan to do a search, even though it's challenging, just to see if there's anything on Montclair that the Schomburg has that would be helpful. So I think it takes tenacity, not giving up, which is we're not doing that. Like you said, it's not impossible, but it may take a little bit longer. But I think we have a determined team, and we're gonna find everything that we need to find. I believe that.
And I think the difficulties that we have faced and have some overcome is part of the story that the Howe House tells. You know, it's part of the narrative that we're going to end up speaking about.
I think part of the inferences that we can make in just looking at how the parcel of land was sold off, to me, it's speculation, pure speculation, that instead of large chunks of land being consumed by other buyers, it was just systematically sold off, and all except Reverend Thompson, all of the buyers that we have looked at were white buyers, and that's eventually where the property ended up in the hands for white people in the area. And I think I'm trying to answer part of the question that's in the chat that's related to this particular question about what was the difficulty. And also the question wants to know what was James Howe doing in between the time that he was manumitted and receiving the house. So that was between 1817 and 1837. So the occupation for most people in the area at that time was farming.
Right.
And although we have no definitive answer to that particular question, I would bet you that James Howe continued to engage in farming within that area. However, the difficulty is, was this what he was actually doing? Census records tell us.
In the 1850s and the 1860 census, he was listed as a laborer.
Okay,
Which means he
but
just
he
did
was
odd jobs
right.
for
So he was
whoever.
blind. He was blind at that time.
You know, well,
So,
that goes to tell you how much money he had or didn't have. You know, he's
exactly,
blind and he still has to keep working to survive.
exactly. Right. So how much of the information that we can get definitively? I doubt very much, but we can make inferences based on, what was happening at the time, what were people doing, and how did they sustain themselves. And for Black folks, it was labor, farming, but there were also others who were doing different things. So not everybody was in a position like that, but Mr. Howe was aging, and he was having health concerns, as described by Philip Doremus in his book as well. So if anybody else has any kind of responses to that particular question, which directly relates to the difficulty
Thanks.
with the social history.
Thanks, Betty and Mike and Janice. I do want to point out that there's often a gendered component to these research complications also, that it's more difficult to research Black people than white people, but it's incredibly difficult to research Black women. The records with regard to Black women in particular are just really non-existent. Yes, so and it gets to paper, right? And that there is more slips of paper that were put together in the 17 and 1800s that connect to men, and the archives connect, collect those and save them. And when we're looking at Black women in particular, it's really difficult to go into the archive and find information about these people. We are fortunate, however, to have the house in its original location. Very little African American material culture from the 18th and 19th century remains, and this is an example of one. So, I am really excited to be involved in this project because we are able to look at, and it really becomes a touch point about material culture of African Americans in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And really, there's so little of this left in our nation, and I think, for the Friends of the Howe House, we have something really special here that exists in so few other places. That the house, and as a result, then it serves as a touch point for many issues in African American history. We can use this object here, this piece of material culture, to start conversations about other elements of African American history. So the rear portion of the house is the oldest, and as I was saying, it goes back to, we believe, the late 1700s, and we're still verifying some of that. And it's just really uncommon to have a piece of material culture from the late 1700s that is so directly connected to Black people. So the northwest corner of the house appears to contain some original construction. We've been able to sort of investigate the foundation, the basement. We've seen mortise and tenon construction in the framing, and possible siding under the shakes. And I'm going to show you some images in a minute. And we're working with an architect, but this is going to need to be officially verified. So the architect we're working with at one point said, we know it's very, very old, but we don't know if it's 150 years old, if it's 200 years old, or if it's 250 years old. So, we had this really great sort of email conversation a few weeks ago after we had kind of pulled some of the drywall off. We'd hired someone to do this really delicately. And we were looking at the cuts of saw blades and sort of speculating as to sort of what kind of saw it was. We know it wasn't a circular saw, and when that might have happened. And the construction of nails changed quite a bit from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, and we were looking for nails and trying to kind of date some of that. So we know it's old, and we're sort of verifying how old it is. So since the original construction, 2 additions have been made. And really all of it, we're looking at what we call vernacular architecture, right? This is not high architecture. No one's going to cite as an example of sort of Victorian architecture or something like that. It's vernacular architecture. It's ordinary, it's domestic, it's functional, and probably many parts of it were constructed by the people who were living there. And this has a different kind of value to social historians. Social historians really want to understand and connect sort of ordinary things, objects, with the lives of the people who were living at that point in time. So starting here, I'm going to start on the right side. The image there where you're seeing sort of the back door of the current house. That corner of the house is the northwest corner, and that is what we believe to be the oldest portion of the house. We believe it was the original Howe house. It is on the inside roughly 9 foot by 11 foot. So, Mike has been talking about, economic issues, and that gives you a sense of the economic issues at play here. So it was a single story with a basement, a basement foundation. So it would have had a basement room, which you entered from the outside, and then an upstairs there. In the middle image here, you can see some foundational differences, and we've been examining the foundation along with our architect to kind of understand. But we also have records that the rear portion in the middle image was an addition, right? So there's been 2 additions, and at some point that 9 foot by 11 foot, they added several more feet onto the east portion of the house. And then later on, the 2-story portion in the front was added. You can see in the image on the left here, we had a contractor come and remove some of the drywall in a few spots. and we're looking at the construction of the home, and that's the part where we were trying to date. And you could see there's siding underneath the shake shingles, and we're sort of trying to investigate whether that siding was original back to the 1700s or whether that was added at some point later. And that is all work that we are currently doing with an architect that has expertise in historic preservation. So I want to just, in terms of the material culture here, and some of the larger topics we've been talking about, this house serves as a touch point for the experience of enslaved people. It serves as a touch point for the experience of freedom for people that moved from slavery, into freedom. And that's a hot topic in history right now. What did freedom mean to people who were formerly enslaved? Through the Howe House, we're going to explore the topic of Northern slavery. We can. Slavery in the North was different than slavery in the South. We can talk about slavery. This is not a story of a large plantation with 100 enslaved people. This is a story about, a smaller family with a smaller group of enslaved people. And that's the way most enslaved people lived. The large plantation with 150 enslaved people, clearly that's many people, but the vast majority of enslaved people lived much more like James Howe did in smaller scale units like this. We can look at the relationship between urban and rural relations, like I was talking about with Newark before, the material culture of Black people in the 1800s. And there's a growing literature now looking at the material culture of slavery. There's some books that deal with the architectural design of slave quarters and things like that. And there's a possibility that the research we do will be able to dovetail into some of that research. Gentrification is clearly a more recent phenomena, but I think this house tells a story of gentrification. Betty and Mike were talking about what happened with the property and how long the Howes and the Olivers were living there, and the sale of this land. And this is a big deal. And we're still dealing in the 21st century with barriers to homeownership for Black families, and the Howe House can become a way to tell that story. I was looking at some of the numbers, and Mike, maybe you can help clarify. When Delilah Howe put the lien on the house with Amzi Ziegler, I think that was for $800.
Yeah, 800
We
bucks.
don't know how much of that she paid off.
She had to pay the 800 at the end of a year,
Right. Okay. So then
and she didn't.
she didn't, and then Amzi Ziegler takes possession. But then I saw another number that about 20 years later, a little less than 20 years later, someone sold her portion of the land for $8,800. Is that accurate?
Well, I'm not sure which. I have to look at all the deeds that Betty found, but basically in 1888, Amzi Ziegler lost the property too.
Yeah, right.
That he obtained.
I was
And
just
so Elizabeth Chapin came into the possession of the property. That may be what you're thinking about. I'm not sure.
So if that number is accurate, it means
Yeah.
in fewer than 20 years, someone profited on this house 1,100%. So when we're looking at barriers to Black owned home ownership, and we look at what has happened here with the economics surrounding this property, there is a white family in Montclair that did very well on this property, and that is the kind of story that we want to unpack through the research on this home, and it will bear onto what's happening in the 21st century with regard to home ownership prices. And home ownership prices are great for some people, but not good for everyone. And Montclair is sort of facing issues with gentrification and rising home ownership. And I think the Howe House will be able to sort of lead to discussions about that. Okay, so I have one more slide here, and that gets to the story of slavery in New Jersey. And, there's many people that are not aware that slavery was embedded in New Jersey. And for 1630, the first enslaved people of African heritage arrived in New Jersey. 1682, the first New Jersey Slave Code was passed into law, which essentially barred any person from helping an enslaved person escape. 1927, there was just under 4,000 enslaved people in New Jersey, approximately 8% of the colony's population. 1786, the trade of enslaved people from Africa was legally prohibited. It continues via the black market, but this essentially happens because there's some rebellions in the Caribbean islands, and white people in the United States at that point were afraid that the rebellious attitude of enslaved people or black people in the Caribbean islands would come up to the United States unless they stopped the trade of enslaved people. So that's a big rationale for ending just, again, the movement of people. Slavery doesn't end, it's just the trade. 1790, there is just under 12,000 enslaved people in New Jersey, which is approximately 6% of the population. And there's about 2,800 free black people in New Jersey at that point in time. In 1804, New Jersey passed a Gradual Emancipation Act. No historian has been able to verify whether any enslaved person was freed by that Emancipation Act, which is not uncommon. So it's emancipation with no teeth, essentially. That was strengthened in 1846, and enslaved people were turned into indentured servants for life. And the children of these indentured servants for life were then enabled to be free. But again, no enslaved person went free because of that Emancipation Act in 1846. In the 1850s and 1860s, over 90, so clearly there's slavery in the North, right? Other states have Emancipation Acts that are more active, that have more teeth. And there's a sort of gradual lowering of enslaved people in places like New York State and Pennsylvania. And in the 1850s and 1860s, over 90% of enslaved people in northern states lived in New Jersey. So New Jersey is this holdout. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the South, but the Emancipation Proclamation was for Southern slavery, not for slavery in northern states. So slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation persisted in New Jersey, even after, enslaved people in Texas found out that they were free. And that's become a holiday now. There were still enslaved people in New Jersey. The 13th Amendment was ratified nationally on December 6, 1865, and that ends slavery nationally. However, New Jersey was slow to ratify that and only begrudgingly ratified that a month and a half later on January 23, 1866. So the Howe House is going to be a way to talk about these kinds of issues, to emphasize a part of the past that has not been discussed enough in New Jersey history and in larger U.S. history. And I just want to say that I'm so excited to be part of this project, with the rest of the history team, and it's great work that we've been doing for the last 2 years. And I want to thank Angelica for letting us have this time to give this presentation.
Thank you all. I just learned so much information. It's fascinating. There were definitely some questions in the chat, so I'm going to start there. And then we can open it up for anyone who else wants to use the chat or just unmute. I know, Linda, you had a few questions or comments, which I'm going to try and condense together. Linda wants to make it known about how town residents had made efforts to take the land from James Howe since he was a Black individual. And what did people do to accomplish that, just to make aware about the challenges regarding Black ownership and property at the time? Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Is that a statement that people in town did try to take the house away from him, or is that a
believe so, or asking, is that in fact the case?
I am not aware of that, of any concerted effort to take the land away.
And
It is
Linda,
my understanding that the Howes sold bits of property because of financial exigency.
Linda, feel free to unmute if you want to clarify what I was reading on your behalf. I know you had a few comments.
Yeah, it was mentioned when I was at a presentation a few months ago about the Howe House. It was a fundraiser, a presentation down in the south end at a church, I think it was. I don't remember, but it was mentioned there, which I thought was really important for people to understand more details about that. If it's accurate, whoever did the presentation, it was a stage and an audience, you know, I don't even remember where it was. So
I think we know that in the 20th century, there's been a struggle in the last couple decades to maintain the Howe House as a historic site. And I think there's been some struggle over that, like what to do with the Howe House and how we can maintain its integrity and things like that. And that's been ongoing. I know in the early 20th century, there was in Betty, you've done some research on that. Some definite attempts to remove the Howe House from its location.
In 1933, the town sent a letter to the owners of the house who did not live in the house, but they were told to tear the house down. At that point, they did a renovation which saved the house at the time. The owners were the Welches. And they were actually ordered. I saw the letter. It said they were told tear this house down by the town.
Well, they felt that it was in disrepair and it was an eyesore in the community. And they had the township issued an ultimatum for them to do something about the house. And the Welshes decided to repair it and get the house in the condition where they could rent it. So they capitalized on the ownership of the house.
Could I say something else while we're talking? I just want to mention for this audience and for yourselves, in case you aren't aware, when I was on a History Center walking tour 3 or 4 years ago, it was mentioned that bank down at the corner of Bloomfield Avenue and it's now a Dunkin' Donuts, the old historic building, Bloomfield Avenue and the corner of Lackawanna Plaza Street. It's a historically designated building, and you still see on the facing Bloomfield Avenue, it's the National People's Bank. That was the first, she said it was the first bank to provide mortgages to the Black families in town. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but I've been trying to get the Black community to put a plaque on that.
I did some research on that building, and I found that it was owned by the son that was the son of the Montclair Times owner.
Oh, no kidding.
And, yes, and the bank was only opened for about 10 years. And it quite possibly did. I didn't know that part about them providing mortgages, but many residents thought that, it was owned by Blacks. But I do believe that probably African Americans managed the bank, but they were not the owners. As a matter of fact, I saw an ad on the internet from someone who buys money that's issued by banks. And that particular bank, the People's National Bank, and people think that because it's named the People's National Bank, that it has some connotation to being of a status within the African American community, but it is a national bank. People's National Bank is in several states in the country. Few of them are still surviving, but that was the information that I found out about it. And I went through the state of New Jersey archives to assist me with this information. And, you know, they provided a lot of what I've just shared with you.
Thanks, Betty.
I also wondered if any of you have comments on why. I thought it was interesting that the Howe house was right in the middle of all the Crane family property that was given to their children. I thought that, do you have any thoughts on that? I thought that was interesting that they put a past servant in the middle of all their family properties, especially at that time.
So that's probably related to the location of the house. And, you know, we've had a handful of conversations about, we don't actually know if an enslaved person lived in that house. You know, and this is, you know, I mean, we sort of assume, and it's kind of a working hypothesis, that this was quarters for enslaved people, but we don't actually know that to a certainty based on archival research. So my hunch is, you know, and this is an educated guess, is that this, you know, this was, you know, a place where laborers lived, and that, or perhaps James Howe was living there as an enslaved person, but we don't know. So probably this land was willed to Howe because he had a relationship with it, you know, before it belonged to him. So
But
that's. Yeah, please, Becky.
well, another important piece that Mike may be able to add to what I'm going to say is that the area did not look the way that we're seeing it. And it was primarily farmland. So it would not have been a house at the time that would have been a major, like in the middle of everything, because there was farmland all around that area. So it would have been appropriate for him to be close to where the work was.
I'm going to shift us to the next question if I can. So thank you all for those responses. So 2 from Kim came in. These are a little more organizational related. So I'm just going to say them all, and then amongst your group, how you'd like to answer. So Kim is asking, when did the Friends of the Howe House form? How original is the house, and how is it protected physically? I know we touched on that during the presentation anyway. What is the ultimate vision for the Howe House, and how would you like it better integrated into the fabric of the town so everyone recognizes its importance?
Betty, do you want to get that, or do you want me to get that?
Angelica, would you repeat the first part of?
Of course. Sorry, it was quite a few things. When did the Friends of the Howe House form, and how much of the house is protected physically? That might be about like the National Register or whatnot, if you can speak to that, if it's listed.
I think, Jeff, you could talk about that, but I think October 2022 was when we first formed at a rally at the Howe House, when we learned that the house was being put on the market by then owner John Van Dyke, his group, his corporate group. And that was when we came up with the banner, "History is not for sale." There have been several attempts in the past to do something with the Howe House, but this is the group that really dedicated themselves to preserving a piece of history that is so hard to hold on to and to even have in our culture, African American culture. And so the importance of this piece is this house is having that rally. That's the importance. And for me, a part of the vision is to continue the education in our culture about slavery, about home ownership, and just the general history that many of us don't get in many arenas unless we go out and find it ourselves.
Yeah,
And I think
I think the second part was what kind of protection. We are currently working on landmarking the house statewide and nationwide. We are in the process of doing that.
And I want to add that Mike is the one has been shouldering the vast majority of that work. So thanks, Mike. The house has local protections, but it does not have national protections, and that's what we're working on there. That's what I mean. And again, Mike is doing the vast majority of that work.
Thank you. And the second part of Kim's question is, what is the ultimate vision for the Howe House, and how would you like it to how would you like it better integrated into the fabric of the town so everyone recognizes its importance?
Betty, do you want to take that, or is there a board member that wants to take
yeah,
it?
is there a board member on? I think I
Amina
saw
is on.
Amina.
I don't know if she's still on.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is a work in
I'm
progress.
sorry, I'm here. What was the first part of the question? My apologies. I couldn't get to the microphone on time. What was the first part of the question? I'm sorry.
Angelica, do you want to ask Amina the question about the future direction of the Howe House?
Yes, I'm scrolling back up in the chat. Sorry, one moment.
Sure.
What is the ultimate vision for the Howe House, and how would you like it better integrated into the fabric of the town so everyone recognizes its importance?
Sure. So right now our mission is to protect and uplift the James Howe House as a tangible reminder of the true history of slavery and its aftermath. As far as the actual home in the next 5 or 10 years, we're still working on that. How would we like to see it woven into the community? We'd like to have children take walking field trips to the Howe House the same way as they do the Crane House. I truly believe that the Crane House and the Howe House is a perfect story of what we pride ourselves on here in Montclair, and that's diversity. If this story pans out to be that Howe is a descendant, if you will, of Mr. Crane, this just shows you how we can live together in the community as one. So, I would like to see this story brought into the schools so children can learn about slavery in New Jersey, learn about home ownership, learn about James Howe. It would be exciting to see something like that happen. Did I answer your question?
I think that did, Amina. I'm not sure if the person who originally asked is still on, but we have it recorded, so we'll have that for the YouTube channel as well. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay, I'm just scrolling back up quickly to make sure I didn't miss some questions that came through. So hang on one moment. Mariana was just making a note that she cannot remember the year when she lost the house, but $800 in 1876 equates to about $22,934 in 2024. So I think we were talking about Delilah, it sounds like, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah, that deed. Another question is, have you found any living descendants of the Howe family?
No.
Okay.
But through the Jackson family plot at Rosedale, we are trying to make a connection to find out if there are any survivors or descendants through the Jackson family via Delilah's marriage to a Jackson. So we're going through the back door, trying to go find a middle door and a front door. And we also have a genealogist from Loudoun County, Virginia, who is also assisting us. So we don't know what he might uncover. And I think he's on this call also.
Yeah.
Joseph.
Hi.
Joseph, hey Joe.
Hi. Yeah, My research has, I'm researching the Howes from Virginia, but they spell it Hoe. And when the family came to Montclair, they changed it to the Hoes, Hooe. So we're trying to figure out if there's a direct connection to the Howe family. So and there's also a lot of connections with other families, other African American families. They live very close to the Howe house. They married into the families like the Olivers and Jackson. So trying to work on all that and figure out all the connections.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm scrolling back up and I think I got to some of the questions that happened earlier on. Would anyone like to unmute and ask any final questions to the historians for the information they presented tonight before we just do some closing announcements?
Mina mentioned there was Mina mentioned something about the possibility of James Howe being a descendant of the Cranes. Did I hear that right?
That needs to be further
That's a
explored.
thought.
Yeah, it's right. So that's what I've been
Right.
sort of, you've
So
heard
you're
me use
wondering.
that word
Yeah.
historical hypothesis.
Right.
We have a lot of those right now. And, the proper way to sort that out would be DNA tests. And we need to find more relatives to do those DNA tests. And until then, it's little more than an educated guess.
Angelica, hi, Kathleen Bennett here. I had asked a question about the construction of the original structure of the Howe House and whether that had any connection with slave quarters construction from the mid-Atlantic, and whether anybody has ever found any evidence of slave quarters at the original site of the Crane House down on Glenridge Avenue. Has anyone ever done any research on that? I don't remember hearing anything, but I don't know if anyone's done that.
From what I've seen in our records, I have not found any information that was recorded on that regarding Israel Crane and his family's home on Glenridge Avenue. Obviously, I can't speak to other Cranes in the different vicinities between that and that of the Howe House location. But what was the other part you just asked about Mid-Atlantic region? I'm sorry, repeat that.
There's the Mid-Atlantic slave quarter construction then, and I just wondered if it's similar in type and construction materials and technique, that you could consider that a slave quarter house. I think listening to the conversation now, where someone said it, and I think Betty said it would have been in the middle of the Crane agricultural lands, which makes sense that or the original structure would have been a very primitive quarter, a primitive structure. And I wonder if there had been any research done to see the similarities with slave quarters from the Mid-Atlantic, which would have been very early, if that's what you're saying, how early this house is.
Kathleen, that's a really great question. Digging into some important historical, ideas there. So I'm a 19th century historian that focuses on material culture, technology. So when I started to get involved with this project about 2 years ago, I started to look at some of the things you're talking about. There's a few historians that do research on the architecture of slave quarters. And so I bought some books and, I've paid a bit more attention to that than I was before 2 years ago. And again, you have to realize that we don't know to a certainty that an enslaved person lived or stayed in this house. I think we suspect that this is how it was used, but we don't know that to a certainty. So I have to start with that. Another interesting thing is that of the books I've read and the sites that I've seen, I've never seen a slave quarters with a basement, and we have a basement. And I'm not sure what that means. Is that because this is the North and it was done differently in the North? Is it because the Crane family had money and they thought, this was a worthwhile thing to sort of put into, this house? Was it because they were storing, apples down? I mean, I'm not, so that has caused me some pause and caused me to sort of question, what we have here. And unfortunately, we have only more questions and not answers. So I would say that what you've asked is a really, really good research question that we are thinking about, but until we have more evidence, I don't know that we have a conclusive answer to it.
Also, Angelica, I think you have a postcard of the Jasper Crane's home over on Plymouth and Harrison. Do you have that postcard in the archives? Well, one of the things that Philip Doremus wrote about in his book was the homestead, the Crane homestead. And he did mention that behind that house, over at the corner of Plymouth and Myrtle, it's no longer there, that there were slave quarters behind it. And so, of course, there were, so that would have to be further researched. But I think that the person that's asking the question is wondering, were there slave quarters in this area? And so that picture or that postcard that's in the Montclair History Center's archives and in Philip Doremus's book does say that there were slave quarters behind that house. We don't know what they may have looked like.
Thanks, Betty, for clarifying that. Erin, who was also on this call, who manages our research library, we'll go ahead and check that tomorrow and take a look at that postcard image and share it.
And then just share the statement, the description that Philip Doremus makes in his book.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's pretty obvious. We know that the Crane family had slaves. The
Oh, yeah.
Doremus book, the
Yeah.
Doremus book explains it. We know that Israel Crane had slaves. In Nathaniel's will to his son William, when the original Nathaniel, not the Nathaniel who freed James Howe, the original Nathaniel left a slave by the name of Shem to his son Noah. So we know the Crane family had slaves. That's unquestionable. I think the Israel Crane slaves lived in the house with the Crane family, I believe.
That's my only assumption I can make from not seeing any research based on any other buildings on the property site as well.
Right.
But I obviously have not been able to confirm that. Yeah. Thank you. I know Janice want to make an announcement for another presentation to share with others about coming up for Friends of the Howe House. Janet, would you just like to note that for those who are still on the call with us?
And Amina, if you can come off of mute as well. We're working together with the local Y in Montclair, and on January 17th at 1 p.m., we're hosting, it's going to be Knowing Your Roots and Local History with a spotlight on the James Howe House. So if you're available, you're more than welcome to join us to further discuss the discussion and to talk about family history and genealogy. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. I just want to give a huge thank you to the Friends of the Howe House, to Mike, Betty, Janice, and Jeff for all of the information you share with us tonight. The research is certainly a journey, and we really look forward to seeing what comes out of that journey for all of you as you continue to find more answers to some of these questions and mysteries that you presented. Tonight's presentation is fully recorded. We will make it available on our YouTube channel next week, so I will make sure that is shared with all the members of the Friends of the Howe House for anyone who missed it. We'll also email to anyone who registered who had to jump off or could not stay for the presentation. So we'll make sure to do that.
Hey, Angelica, real quick, February 17th, don't want to forget for the folks that are on, it's not January, February 17th.
February 17th, you got it, yes.
you.
And I also want to note that Betty with the Montclair African American Heritage Foundation is hosting a Black History Month event at the Montclair History Center's Crane House and Historic Y on February 18th. And that's honoring the legacy and life of Alice Huey Foster, who was integral to the Women's YWCA in that space as well. So please connect with our organizations. I'm trying to find my chat because I want to make sure I'm putting in the chat the Friends the Howe House link again, and I can't find, there's my chat button. Please support them, see what the organization is doing, get on their mailing list if you're not already. And we hope to hear some more updates soon. Thank you so much, everyone.